He called me expired talent, in front of the whole department. That was bold. For a man who didn't realize I was the owner's daughter. And the largest shareholder after him. They thought I was just the quiet, overqualified operations manager. In 3 days, they'd discover I held the power to decide his future and theirs. My name is Emily Whitlow, and I'm about to tell you how I turned the tables on corporate ageism without firing a single person. The fluorescent lights in conference room B buzzed with their usual Monday morning intensity as I settled into my chair. Ceramic mug of black coffee warming my hands. At 46, I'd learned that corporate meetings were marathons, not sprints, and caffeine was my fuel of choice. The familiar weight of my father's watch pressed against my wrist, a constant reminder of the legacy I carried, though no one in this room knew it. Cole Maddox strutted in precisely at 9, his tailored navy suit screaming expensive confidence. At 35, he embodied everything our board of directors thought they wanted: young, aggressive, and armed with an MBA from Wharton. 6 months ago, they'd hired him as innovation director to modernize Viratech's approach to enterprise management solutions. What they'd gotten was a man who confused ruthlessness with leadership. "Morning, team," he announced, not really looking at anyone as he plugged his laptop into the presentation system. "Time to discuss the future of this company." I watched him from my usual spot, middle of the table, neither too eager nor too distant. 24 years at Viratech had taught me the art of strategic positioning, both physically and professionally. Cole's eyes swept the room, cataloging faces like a general surveying troops. When his gaze landed on me, something cold flickered there. "Before we dive into Q3 projections," he began, his voice carrying that particular brand of authority that men his age wielded like weapons. "I want to address something that's been bothering me about our department's trajectory." The room fell silent. Marketing Director Janet Chen, no relation to any Chen I'd worked with before, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Tom from IT cleared his throat. Even the usually chatty interns seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Cole clicked to his first slide: Workforce Optimization for the Digital Age. The subtitle read, Embracing Innovation Through Strategic Personnel Alignment. "The technology sector moves at light speed," he continued, pacing now like a professor delivering a lecture. "What worked 5 years ago is obsolete today. What worked 10 years ago is archaeological. We need minds that can adapt, pivot, and innovate without the burden of legacy thinking." I took a sip of my coffee, noting how his rhetoric danced around what he really wanted to say. Corporate speak was an art form, and Cole was painting a masterpiece of discrimination with carefully chosen words. "Which brings me to a hard truth," he said, stopping directly across from me. "What we need is fast brains, not fossils clinging to outdated systems." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Every eye in the room turned to me, then quickly away. The younger employees stared at their laptops. The older ones, all 3 of us over 40, sat statue still. Only Cole maintained eye contact, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. I set down my mug with deliberate care, the ceramic making the faintest sound against the polished table. In my peripheral vision, I could see Janet's knuckles white as she gripped her pen. Tom's face had gone red, whether from anger or embarrassment, I couldn't tell. "Interesting perspective," I said, my voice steady as lake water. "Would you care to elaborate on what constitutes fossil behavior in our current operational framework?" Cole's smirk widened. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Emily. Resistance to change, comfort with inefficiency, the inability to think outside established paradigms." The room had become a vacuum. Even the air conditioning seemed to hold its breath. "I see," I replied, making a note in my ever-present notebook. Not about the meeting agenda, but about this moment, time, date, witnesses, exact words. "And you believe age directly correlates with these limitations?" "I believe results speak for themselves," Cole shot back. "Look at our most successful initiatives from the past year. Who led them? Who drove innovation? The pattern is pretty clear." He wasn't wrong about the pattern, but he was wrong about the cause. The younger employees got the high visibility projects, the resources, the mentorship. The older staff got maintenance tasks and legacy support. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy wrapped in corporate restructuring. Well, I said, closing my notebook with a soft snap. I appreciate your transparency. Cole nodded, apparently satisfied that he'd made his point. He moved on to quarterly projections, customer retention metrics, and upcoming product launches. I participated when required, asked thoughtful questions, and gave the appearance of someone who'd accepted their place in his new world order. But inside, something had crystallized. Not anger. Anger was too hot, too visible. This was colder, more patient. This was the moment I decided to stop being invisible. After the meeting, I walked back to my office with measured steps, greeting colleagues with my usual professional warmth. My workspace was modest by executive standards, a corner office, yes, but I'd never bothered to upgrade the furniture or add personal touches beyond a single photo of my father and a small succulent that somehow thrived under fluorescent lighting. I closed the door and sat behind my desk, pulling out my phone to scroll through my contacts. James Morrison, our chief legal officer, answered on the second ring. Emily, good to hear from you. How's the operational side treating you? Interesting question, I said, activating the speaker function and setting the phone on my desk. James, I need to ask you something confidential. What's the company's current stance on age discrimination policies? A pause. That's oddly specific. Are you asking hypothetically? I'm asking as someone who just sat through a meeting where the innovation director suggested that employees over 40 are fossils clinging to outdated systems. Direct quote. Jesus, Emily. Are you serious? Dead serious. I have witnesses, dates, everything documented. But I'm not calling for legal action, not yet. I'm calling because I want to understand what protections exist for employees who might face retaliation for challenging these attitudes. Another pause, longer this time. Emily, you know you don't need to worry about retaliation, right? I mean, given your position. My position as operations strategist, because I'm pretty sure that position doesn't come with immunity from workplace discrimination. Your position as the largest individual shareholder after... He stopped himself. Wait, does Cole know? Know what? About your shares, about your father, about the fact that you technically outrank everyone in that room except the board itself. I leaned back in my chair, considering the question. James, when I joined this company at 22, I made a conscious choice to build my career on merit, not inheritance. I've never used my shareholding as leverage in day-to-day operations. Most employees don't even know Henry Whitlow had a daughter. But management knows. The board knows. The board knows there's a silent partner who inherited Henry's shares. They don't necessarily connect that to the woman who brings homemade cookies to the Christmas party. James chuckled despite himself. Emily, you've been flying under the radar for 24 years. Maybe it's time to turn on the landing lights. After hanging up, I sat in the growing afternoon shadows, thinking about my father. Henry Whitlow had built Veritech from nothing, coding the first versions of our enterprise management software in his garage while I was in elementary school. He taught me that real power wasn't about commanding attention. It was about understanding systems, seeing connections others missed, and knowing exactly when to act. He'd also taught me that the most dangerous opponents were the ones who underestimated you. I opened my laptop and began typing. Not a complaint, not a resignation, but something else entirely. A proposal. A detailed analysis of our current workforce demographics, productivity metrics, and innovation outputs. I'd been collecting this data for months, not for any specific purpose, but because information was power, and I'd learned long ago to stay armed. The numbers told a story that would make Cole very uncomfortable. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray Seattle drizzle that made everyone move a little slower. Think a little deeper. I'd been in the office since 7, using the quiet hours to finalize my documentation and prepare for what was coming. The automated coffee maker in the break room had become my co-conspirator, providing the fuel I needed to think clearly about my next moves. Cole arrived at his usual time, swagger intact despite the weather. I watched him through my office window as he settled into his corner workspace, larger than mine, with a view of the city skyline that he'd specifically requested during his hiring negotiations. He was already on his phone, gesturing animatedly at whoever was unfortunate enough to be on the receiving end of his morning energy. I gave him 30 minutes to get settled, then knocked on his door frame. "Got a minute?" I asked, holding a manila folder that had become thick with documentation over the past 18 hours. "Sure, Emily. Come on in." He gestured to the chair across from his desk without looking up from his computer. "What's on your mind?" "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about fossils and outdated systems." Now I had his attention. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled in front of him like a professor preparing to deliver a lecture to a struggling student. And I realized you're absolutely right about one thing. This company has a serious problem with outdated thinking." Cole's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm glad you're being receptive to feedback." "Oh, I'm very receptive to feedback. In fact, I've spent the last day analyzing our departmental performance metrics, and I've identified some fascinating patterns." I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a spreadsheet that had taken me 3 hours to compile and cross-reference. "For instance," I continued, setting the paper on his desk, "did you know that our 3 highest-performing accounts are all managed by employees over 45, and that our most innovative process improvements in the last 2 years came from our supposedly outdated systems team?" Cole glanced at the spreadsheet, his expression shifting from confidence to wariness. "Emily, I think you might be misinterpreting the data." "Am I? Because I've also been looking at our recent hiring patterns, and I notice we've had some interesting demographic shifts." I placed another document on his desk. 8 departures in the last 6 months, all voluntary, according to HR. All employees over 40. "That's just coincidence. People make career choices." "Interesting coincidence, especially when you consider that 6 of those 8 employees cited cultural misalignment as their primary reason for leaving." I met his eyes directly. "Tell me, Cole, what do you think they meant by cultural misalignment?" He shifted in his chair, the first crack in his composed facade. "Look, Emily, I appreciate your analytical approach to this, but I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here. I'm trying to understand how a company founded on innovation and excellence ended up with a leadership philosophy that equates experience with obsolescence." "That's not what I said." "No. What you said was that we need fast brains, not fossils clinging to outdated systems." I'm just trying to understand how we define fossil behavior in a company that was built by someone who was 63 when he launched our most successful product line. Cole's jaw tightened. "Emily, I think you're taking this too personally." "Am I?" "Because I'm looking at performance reviews, and I'm seeing a pattern where employees over 40 consistently receive lower ratings for adaptability and innovation potential, regardless of their actual output." I placed a third document on his desk. "Would you like to explain how that's not personal?" "Those reviews are based on objective criteria." "Objective criteria developed by whom? Using what baseline? And peer-reviewed by which demographic?" The questions hung in the air like accusation. Cole's phone buzzed against his desk, but he ignored it, focused now on the conversation that was clearly not going the way he'd expected. "Emily, I think you're overcomplicating this. The company needs to stay competitive, and that means making hard decisions about resource allocation and team composition. Hard decisions, like moving me from the innovation strategy project to facilities management. That was a strategic reallocation based on departmental needs. Departmental needs that required replacing someone with 24 years of industry experience with someone who graduated last spring." Cole leaned forward, his patience finally fraying. "Emily, I don't know what you want me to say. This is business. Results matter more than tenure." "Results? Interesting." I pulled out my final document, the one I'd been saving for this moment. Let's talk about results. Specifically, let's talk about the results of the innovation strategy project since it was transferred to your protege. I slid the paper across his desk. Cole's eyes widened as he scanned the numbers. That can't be right. 3 months, 0 deliverables, budget overrun of 37%, timeline extended indefinitely. I leaned back in my chair. Tell me more about how results matter more than tenure. There have been complications. Market conditions changed. The client requirements evolved. Complications that I predicted in my transition memo. Market conditions I warned about in my final project notes. Client requirements that I specifically flagged as unrealistic given the proposed timeline. I stood up, collecting my documents. But I'm just a fossil, so what do I know? Cole's face had gone pale. Emily, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Has there? Because I think the understanding is perfectly clear. You believe that age equals obsolescence, that experience equals inflexibility, and that the best way to innovate is to discard everything that came before. That's not what you said. Actually, it is. And not just what you said, but what you've systematically implemented through hiring, firing, project allocation, and performance evaluation. I paused at his door. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I left him sitting there, staring at the papers scattered across his desk like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. But I wasn't done. Not even close. The rest of the week passed in a strange sort of suspended animation. Cole avoided me in meetings, spoke to me only when necessary, and seemed to be recalibrating his approach to the department. But I knew that temporary discomfort wasn't the same as lasting change. Men like Cole didn't transform overnight. They adapted their tactics, learned to be more subtle, more careful with their words. I needed something bigger, something that would force a reckoning not just with him, but with the entire system that had allowed his attitudes to flourish. Friday afternoon brought the announcement I'd been waiting for, the company's 25th anniversary gala, a black tie affair at the Fairmont Olympic with the entire senior leadership team, key clients, and major stakeholders. The invitation appeared in my inbox with the subject line, Celebrating 25 Years of Innovation and Excellence. I read through the agenda, noting the list of speakers, the planned presentations, the timeline of events, and then I made a phone call. Margaret, it's Emily Whitlow. I need to ask you about the anniversary gala. Margaret Santos, our chief financial officer, had been with the company almost as long as I had. She was one of the few people who knew my full story, who understood the delicate balance I'd maintained between my inherited position and my earned role. Emily, please tell me you're planning to attend. We need some familiar faces in the crowd. I'm planning to attend, but I need to know, will there be any recognition of founding contributors? Any mention of the early days? Of course, we're doing a whole presentation on Henry's vision and legacy. Why? Because I think it's time people understood what that legacy actually means. Not just the technology, but the values, the culture, the belief that innovation comes from experience, not just enthusiasm. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Emily, are you planning something? I'm planning to attend a gala celebrating my father's company. And I'm planning to remind people what he actually stood for. The board will be there, the major shareholders. Are you sure you want to? Margaret, I've been hiding in plain sight for 24 years. I think it's time to step into the light. After hanging up, I did something I hadn't done in years. I made an appointment with a personal shopper. If I was going to reveal myself, I was going to do it properly. The Fairmont Olympic Hotel glittered like a jewel against the Seattle skyline. Its grand ballroom transformed into a shrine to corporate achievement. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over round tables draped in company colors, while a string quartet played softly in the corner. The city's business elite mingled over cocktails, their conversations a symphony of deal-making and networking. I stood in the hotel's marble foyer, smoothing down the lines of my dress, a midnight blue creation that had cost more than my monthly salary but felt like armor. The personal shopper had been right. Sometimes the right outfit was less about appearance and more about confidence. Tonight, I needed every advantage I could get. Emily, my God, you look stunning. I turned to find David Chen, our Chief Technology Officer, approaching with a champagne flute in each hand. He offered me one with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. Thank you, David. You clean up pretty well yourself. I almost didn't recognize you. I mean, you always look professional. But tonight, he gestured vaguely at my transformation. Special occasion? You could say that. We made small talk about the event, the company's growth, the impressive guest list. David was a good man, someone who'd always treated me with respect regardless of my perceived position in the corporate hierarchy. He was also someone who had no idea that the woman he was chatting with about quarterly projections owned nearly half the company he worked for. There's Cole, David said, nodding toward the entrance. I have to admit, I'm curious to see how he handles himself tonight. Big crowd, lots of important people. I followed his gaze to where Cole stood near the registration table, resplendent in a perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was already working the room, shaking hands with board members, laughing at what I assumed were appropriately timed jokes. In his element, surrounded by the kind of people who made decisions that affected hundreds of employees. He certainly seems confident, I observed. Maybe too confident, David said quietly. I've heard some concerning things about his management style. Some of the older employees are feeling pretty demoralized. I sipped my champagne, noting the bubble's sharp bite against my tongue. What kind of things? Comments about age, experience, that sort of thing. Nothing actionable, but... He shrugged. It's creating a toxic environment for anyone over 40. Have you said anything to management? What would I say? That someone's being subtly discriminatory? That people feel uncomfortable but can't prove anything concrete? David shook his head. It's not my place to make waves. Before I could respond, the lights dimmed slightly, and a voice came over the sound system asking guests to find their seats for dinner and the evening's presentations. I found my assigned table near the back of the room, appropriate for someone of my supposed rank, and settled in next to Janet from marketing and Tom from IT. The dinner conversation was pleasant but forgettable, the kind of safe corporate socializing that filled these events. I participated when appropriate, laughed at the right moments, and all the while, I watched. I watched Cole at his table near the front, animated and engaging. I watched the board members at their prominent positions, comfortable in their roles as company leaders. I watched the entire ecosystem of power and influence that had evolved around my father's creation. After the main course, Margaret Santos took the podium to begin the evening's presentations. She spoke eloquently about Viratech's journey from startup to industry leader, about the challenges overcome and the victories achieved. She talked about market share and revenue growth, about innovation cycles and competitive advantages. And then she introduced a video presentation about the company's founder. The lights dimmed completely as Henry Whitlow's face appeared on the large screens positioned around the room. It was footage from an interview he'd given 5 years before his death, his voice strong and clear as he talked about his vision for the company. Technology is only as good as the people who use it, he said, his familiar smile warming the darkened room. And the best people aren't always the youngest or the fastest. They're the ones who understand that innovation comes from combining experience with imagination, wisdom with wonder. I felt my chest tighten as I watched him speak about the values that had guided his decisions, the culture he'd tried to build, the importance of respecting every employee's contribution regardless of their age or background. I built this company on the belief that diversity of thought comes from diversity of experience. His recorded voice continued. The day we start valuing enthusiasm over expertise, potential over proven ability, is the day we lose our competitive edge. The video ended to enthusiastic applause, and Margaret returned to the podium for the next segment of the program. But I was no longer listening to her words. Instead, I was thinking about my father's voice, about the values he'd articulated so clearly, about the company he'd built and the culture that had evolved in his absence. I was thinking about Cole's words. Fast brains, not fossils clinging to outdated systems. I was thinking about the 8 employees who'd left in the past 6 months, all citing cultural misalignment. I was thinking about the woman who'd brought homemade cookies to the Christmas party for 24 years, who'd sat quietly in the back of meetings, who'd never claimed the power that was rightfully hers. And I was thinking about whether it was time to change that. The moment came sooner than I'd expected. During the networking portion of the evening, I found myself in conversation with several board members near the bar. They were discussing the company's future direction, the challenges of staying competitive in a rapidly evolving market, the importance of attracting and retaining top talent. The key is fresh thinking, board member Patricia Williams was saying. We need to avoid the trap of legacy mindset that can stagnate growth. Absolutely, agreed fellow board member Robert Martinez. That's why we brought in Cole. He's exactly the kind of forward-thinking leader we need. I was about to respond when I felt a presence beside me. Cole himself had joined our circle, his timing perfect as always. Are you talking about me? He asked with a charming smile. I hope it's all good things. All good things, Patricia assured him. We were just discussing the importance of fresh perspectives in leadership. It's crucial. Cole agreed, his voice carrying that familiar note of authority. Companies that cling to outdated approaches get left behind. We need to be willing to make hard decisions about resource allocation and team composition. I recognized the language. It was almost identical to what he'd said in our private conversation. But here, in front of the board, it sounded like strategic thinking rather than age discrimination. What kind of hard decisions? I asked quietly. Cole turned to me, clearly not expecting the question. Oh, hello, Emily. I didn't see you there. I'm easy to overlook, I replied, meeting his eyes. You were saying something about hard decisions. Just standard restructuring, ensuring we have the right people in the right positions to drive innovation. He turned back to the board members. It's about building a team that can adapt quickly to changing market conditions. And how do you define the right people? I pressed. Patricia and Robert exchanged glances, perhaps sensing undercurrents they didn't fully understand. Cole's smile became slightly strained. People who embrace change rather than resist it. People who can think outside established paradigms. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. People who understand that in technology, yesterday's solutions are today's problems. Interesting perspective, I said, sipping my champagne. Tell me, Cole, what do you think my father would have made of that philosophy? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Cole's confident expression wavered as he processed what I'd said, the implications slowly dawning on him. Your father? He asked carefully. Henry Whitlow. You know, the man who founded this company when he was 47 years old. The one who developed our most successful product line when he was 63. The one who believed that innovation comes from combining experience with imagination. The color drained from Cole's face as the board members turned to look at me with new interest. Patricia's eyes widened in recognition. Emily Whitlow, she said slowly. Of course, you have his eyes. And his 45% stake in the company, I added matter-of-factly. The words dropped into the conversation like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to encompass the entire group. Robert Martinez nearly choked on his drink. Patricia's mouth opened and closed without sound. And Cole stood frozen, his corporate confidence cracking like ice under spring sun. 45%, Cole managed to whisper. 45%, I confirmed. Which makes me the largest individual shareholder after the company itself. I turned to Patricia and Robert. I'm sorry I haven't been more visible in ownership matters. I've always preferred to let my work speak for itself. Patricia recovered first, her corporate instincts kicking in. Emily, we had no idea you were... That is, we knew Henry had a daughter. But we never connected. That the operations strategist was also the primary inheritor, I can understand the confusion. I've made a point of keeping my professional and ownership roles separate. I glanced at Cole. who still looked like he was seeing a ghost. I thought it was important to earn my position rather than inherit it. That's admirable, Robert said, clearly struggling to recalibrate his understanding of the woman he'd been casually chatting with moments before. Is it? I asked. Because I'm starting to wonder if my approach has been too passive. If by staying in the background, I've allowed the company culture to drift away from the values my father intended. Cole found his voice, though it came out smaller than his usual commanding tone. Emily, I had no idea. If you'd known what? That I was wealthy? That I had influence? Would that have changed how you treated me? I shook my head. Because the woman you called a fossil on Monday morning is the same woman standing here tonight. The only thing that's changed is your perception of my power. I never called you a fossil, Cole protested weakly. No. You called me an unnamed fossil clinging to outdated systems. Much more professional. I turned back to the board members. Which brings me to something I've been meaning to discuss with you both. I think it's time I took a more active role in company oversight. Patricia and Robert exchanged another look, this one carrying the weight of instant political calculation. What kind of role? Patricia asked carefully. The kind that ensures we honor my father's vision while still driving innovation. The kind that recognizes experience as an asset rather than a liability. I glanced around the room, noting other conversations that had slowed as people began to notice our intense discussion. The kind that prevents good employees from leaving because they feel unwelcome in their own workplace. Are you talking about taking a board position? Robert asked. I'm talking about taking responsibility for the company my father built and the culture he intended to create. I finished my champagne and set the glass on a nearby table. But we can discuss the details later. Tonight is supposed to be a celebration. I started to walk away, then paused and turned back to Cole. Oh, and Cole, I think we should schedule a meeting first thing Monday morning. We have a lot to discuss about the future direction of your department. I left him standing there, his face pale and his confidence shattered, while the board members began what I knew would be a very long and very interesting conversation about corporate governance and shareholder rights. The weekend passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and careful planning. Word had spread quickly through the company's leadership about my revelation at the gala, and my inbox was flooded with messages from colleagues who suddenly remembered interactions with me in an entirely different light. Margaret Santos called Saturday morning to discuss the legal and financial implications of my taking a more active ownership role. James Morrison called Saturday afternoon to brief me on corporate governance procedures and shareholder rights. Even David Chen reached out, apologizing for not recognizing the signs of what he called obvious executive presence in our previous interactions. But the most interesting call came Sunday evening from Patricia Williams. Emily, I hope you don't mind me calling you at home. We need to talk about Monday's board meeting. I'd been expecting this. What about it? We're calling an emergency session to discuss recent developments. Your intentions regarding company leadership, Cole's position, the whole situation. And we need to understand what you want. Are you looking to replace Cole? Take over his department? Join the board yourself? I considered the questions, each one representing a different path forward. Patricia, what I want is for this company to honor the values my father built it on. I want employees to be valued for their contributions, not discarded because of their age. I want innovation that comes from wisdom and experience, not just enthusiasm and ambition. That's admirable, but it's also vague. We need specifics. Then here's a specific. I want Cole to remain in his position. Silence on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, what? You heard me? I want Cole to keep his job, but I want him to earn it properly this time. Emily, I don't understand. After what happened at the gala, after what you've told us about his management style. Patricia, firing Cole would be the easy solution. It would also be the wrong one. I walked to my kitchen window, looking out at the city lights that stretched toward the horizon. The problem isn't just Cole, it's the system that hired him, the culture that rewarded his behavior, the values that prioritized youth over experience without question. So what are you proposing? I'm proposing that we fix the system, and that we use Cole's transformation as proof that it can be done. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Seattle feel like a city of infinite possibility. I arrived at the office early, as had become my habit. But this time I wasn't hiding in the shadows. I was preparing for war. My first stop was Cole's office. I found him there before 8, staring at his computer screen with the hollow-eyed intensity of someone who'd spent the weekend contemplating the destruction of everything he'd worked to build. "Good morning, Cole." He looked up with the expression of a man facing his executioner. "Emily, I was hoping we could talk. That's why I'm here." I closed his door and took the seat across from his desk, the same chair I'd occupied during our confrontation the previous week. "I want to make you an offer." "An offer?" "A chance to prove that people can change, that the capacity for growth isn't limited to the young." I leaned forward, my voice serious but not unkind. "I want you to keep your job, Cole, but I want you to earn it properly this time." He blinked, clearly not expecting this turn of events. "I don't understand." "You will. The board is meeting this afternoon to discuss recent developments. They're going to ask for my recommendations regarding your position and the department's future direction. And you're going to recommend that I be fired. I'm going to recommend that you be given a chance to lead the most important initiative in the company's history." I pulled out a folder, thicker than the one I'd brought the previous week, filled with weeks of careful analysis and strategic planning. "I want you to spearhead the development of our new Cultural Sustainability Program." Cole's eyebrows furrowed. Cultural sustainability? A comprehensive initiative designed to ensure that Viratech remains innovative and competitive while honoring the experience and wisdom of all employees, regardless of age. I opened the folder and placed the first document on his desk. It includes mentorship programs, cross-generational project teams, bias training for managers, and performance evaluation reforms. He stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. "Emily, why would you want me to lead this, after everything that's happened?" "Because you're exactly the wrong person for the job," I said simply. "Which makes you exactly the right person to prove it can be done." "I don't follow your logic." "Cole, you're young, ambitious, and convinced that innovation requires discarding the past. You've also demonstrated a clear bias against older employees and a belief that experience equals obsolescence." I paused, watching his face carefully. "If you can learn to value wisdom alongside enthusiasm, to see experience as an asset rather than a liability, then anyone can." He was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. "And if I can't? If I fail?" "Then you'll have failed publicly, transparently, and in a way that demonstrates exactly why these changes are necessary." I smiled, but it wasn't entirely warm. "Either way, the company wins." That's pretty manipulative. That's leadership." "Cole?" "The ability to create situations where the right outcome is inevitable, regardless of individual choices." I stood up, leaving the folder on his desk. "The board meeting is at 3. I'll be presenting this proposal and recommending you as the program director. What you do with that opportunity is entirely up to you." I was almost to the door when he called my name. "Emily." I turned back. "Why didn't you tell me who you were, from the beginning?" "Because I wanted to see who you really were first," I replied. "And because I needed to understand whether this company was still the place my father intended it to be." "And is it?" I looked at him sitting there, surrounded by the evidence of his potential transformation, and felt something that might have been hope. "Ask me again in 6 months." The board meeting that afternoon was unlike any I'd attended in my 24 years at Viratech. For the first time, I sat at the head of the table, not as Emily the operations strategist, but as Emily Whitlow, primary shareholder and daughter of the founder. The transformation was more than positional. It was psychological, both for me and for the 5 board members who suddenly found themselves accountable to someone they'd barely noticed before. "Before we begin," I said, looking around the polished mahogany table, I want to address the elephant in the room. Yes, I've been invisible for 2 decades. Yes, I've allowed this company to operate without meaningful input from its largest shareholder, and yes, that ends today. Patricia Williams, Robert Martinez, Margaret Santos, James Morrison, and David Chen all nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Only James seemed entirely comfortable with the shift in dynamics, probably because he'd been expecting it for years. The question, I continued, is not whether I have the right to take a more active role. The 45% shareholding settles that debate. The question is how we're going to use this moment to rebuild something my father would recognize as his company. I activated the presentation screen and clicked to my first slide. Cultural Sustainability Initiative, Transforming Viratech's Approach to Human Capital. Over the past 6 months, we've lost 8 employees to what they described as cultural misalignment. All were over 40. All cited feeling undervalued and marginalized. All left for competitors who recognized their worth. I clicked to the next slide, showing our competitor analysis. 3 of them are now leading innovation teams at companies that are eating into our market share. Robert Martinez shifted uncomfortably. Emily, we were told those departures were voluntary, part of natural workforce evolution. They were voluntary in the same way that jumping from a burning building is voluntary, I replied. When employees feel they have no future with their current employer, they make rational decisions about their careers. David Chen leaned forward. Are you saying Cole's management style drove them away? I'm saying that Cole's management style is a symptom of a larger cultural problem, one that starts with our hiring practices, continues through our promotion criteria, and culminates in leadership decisions that equate age with obsolescence. I clicked to a new slide showing the detailed proposal I'd outlined to Cole that morning. The Cultural Sustainability Initiative addresses these issues through 4 core components. First, a mentorship program that pairs employees across generational lines, not older mentoring younger, but true, bi-directional learning exchanges. Patricia raised her hand. How would that work practically? A 60-year-old engineer teaches a 25-year-old about system architecture and client relationship management. The 25-year-old teaches the engineer about emerging technologies and social media marketing strategies. Both learn, both contribute, both feel valued. I move to the next section. Second, cross-generational project teams for all major initiatives. No more age-homogeneous groups working in isolation. Every team must include representatives from at least 3 different decades of professional experience. Margaret spoke up. That could slow down project timelines if we're forcing artificial team compositions. Or it could prevent the kind of costly mistakes that come from groupthink and limited perspectives, I countered. How much time and money would we have saved on the innovation strategy project if we'd included voices that could predict client pushback and market resistance? The room fell silent. Everyone knew about the project's spectacular failure under Cole's protégé. Third, I continued. Comprehensive bias training for all managers, with a focus on age-related discrimination and the difference between managing energy and managing wisdom. And fourth, James asked, performance evaluation reform. Current reviews heavily weight adaptability and innovation potential, subjective measures that unconsciously favor younger employees. We'll replace them with objective metrics, problem-solving effectiveness, knowledge transfer capability, and measurable contribution to team success. I paused, looking around the table at faces that ranged from intrigued to skeptical. Now comes the interesting part, I said. I want Cole Maddox to lead this initiative. The reaction was immediate and unanimous. Absolutely not. Patricia said, Emily, that makes no sense. Robert added, he's the problem, not the solution. Margaret chimed in. I held up my hand for silence. Cole is 35 years old, Harvard MBA, 6 months at Viratech, and convinced that innovation requires discarding experience. He's also charismatic, intelligent, and capable of learning, if properly motivated. Motivated how? David asked. by making his career success dependent on the success of this program. If he can transform his own attitudes and management style, he proves the initiative works. If he can't, he demonstrates exactly why we need it. James smiled. He was the first to see the elegance of the trap I was setting. And either way, the company benefits. Exactly. But more than that, if Cole succeeds, he becomes a powerful advocate for cultural change. A young, dynamic leader who publicly embraced the value of experience sends a message throughout the industry. Patricia was shaking her head. Emily, this is incredibly risky. What if he sabotages the program? What if he pays lip service to change while undermining it behind the scenes? Then we document his failure and use it as justification for more dramatic changes. But I don't think that's what will happen. Why not? I clicked to my final slide, showing a timeline and success metrics. Because Cole is ambitious above all else. And I'm going to make it clear that his advancement opportunities, not just here, but anywhere in the industry, depend on his ability to evolve. Robert frowned. That sounds like coercion. That sounds like consequences, I corrected. For the first time in his career, Cole's success will be measured not by how effectively he can marginalize older employees, but by how well he can integrate and leverage their expertise. The room was quiet as the board members absorbed the proposal. I could see them running calculations, political, financial, and practical. Finally, Margaret spoke. What kind of authority would Cole have in this role? Complete authority over program development and implementation. With one caveat, I retain veto power over any decision that contradicts the initiative's core principles. And what's your role in all this? Patricia asked. Oversight and guidance. I'll work with Cole to develop the program structure, provide strategic direction, and ensure we stay true to my father's vision for the company. David leaned back in his chair. Emily, I have to ask, are you planning to take a more active role in company operations going forward? I'm planning to take exactly as active a role as necessary to ensure this company remains true to its founding values. I closed my laptop and stood up. 24 years ago, I chose to prove myself through merit rather than inheritance. That choice served its purpose, but it also allowed problems to develop that I should have addressed years ago. I looked around the table one final time. The question now is whether you're willing to support the changes necessary to fix those problems, or whether you'd prefer to find yourselves replaced by a new board that shares my vision for the company's future. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakably clear. As the largest shareholder, I had the power to reconstitute the board if necessary. Everyone in the room understood the implications. I'll need a formal vote on the Cultural Sustainability Initiative and Cole's appointment as program director, I said. All in favor. One by one, hands rose around the table. Patricia was the last, her expression resigned but not hostile. Motion carries unanimously, James announced with obvious satisfaction. Excellent. Cole will be informed of his new role and responsibilities tomorrow morning. I expect the program to be fully operational within 60 days. I gathered my materials and headed for the door. Oh, and from now on, I'll be attending all board meetings. It's time I started acting like the owner of this company. Tuesday morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes after irrevocable decisions have been made. I arrived at Cole's office at exactly 9 o'clock, carrying a leather portfolio that contained the formal documentation of his new role and the detailed expectations that would govern his performance. I found him pacing behind his desk, still in yesterday's shirt, looking like a man who'd spent the night wrestling with angels and demons. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested very little sleep. Emily, he said when I knocked on his open door. I was hoping you'd come by. Good morning, Cole. May I come in? Of course, please. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where this whole confrontation had begun the previous week. I settled myself and opened the portfolio. The board approved the Cultural Sustainability Initiative yesterday afternoon. You've been appointed as program director, effective immediately. I heard. Margaret called me last night to make it official. He sat down heavily. looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Emily, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. All right. Is this a setup? Are you giving me enough rope to hang myself? The question was more perceptive than I'd expected. That depends entirely on what you do with the rope, doesn't it? That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're going to get. I pulled out the first document and placed it on his desk. This is your mandate. Develop and implement a comprehensive program that demonstrates how companies can innovate while honoring experience, how they can embrace change while valuing wisdom. Cole picked up the document, scanning the detailed requirements and success metrics. These goals are ambitious. They're necessary. And they're achievable if you're willing to challenge your own assumptions about age, experience, and innovation. And if I can't, then you'll fail publicly, spectacularly, and in a way that justifies every change I want to make to this company's culture. I leaned forward, my voice serious but not unkind. Cole, I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm trying to save you from becoming someone you'll regret being. He set down the document and looked at me directly. Why do you care? After everything I've said, everything I've done, why not just fire me and be done with it? Because firing you would be easy, and easy solutions rarely create lasting change. I pulled out a second document. This is a detailed analysis of your management decisions over the past 6 months. Every project assignment, every performance review, every hiring and promotion recommendation. Cole's face paled as he realized what he was looking at. The pattern is clear. Cole, you consistently favor younger employees for high-visibility projects. You rate older employees lower on subjective measures like adaptability and innovation potential. You use language that subtly undermines the value of experience while elevating the importance of fresh thinking. I never meant intent doesn't matter, impact does. And the impact of your leadership style has been to create an environment where experienced employees feel unwelcome and undervalued. Cole was quiet for a long moment, studying the data that laid out his biases in stark black and white. So, what happens now? Now you prove that you can change. That someone with your background and beliefs can learn to value experience alongside enthusiasm, wisdom alongside ambition. I stood up and placed the final document on his desk. This is your development plan. You'll work directly with me to design the Cultural Sustainability Initiative. You'll participate in reverse mentoring sessions with employees over 50. You'll lead cross-generational project teams and learn to leverage the full spectrum of experience available to us. And if you succeed, you'll have demonstrated something that could transform how companies think about age, experience, and innovation. You'll also have secured your future in an industry that's increasingly focused on inclusive leadership. Cole picked up the development plan, his eyes widening as he read through the requirements. This is comprehensive. It's thorough. Change is hard work. Cole, if it were easy, everyone would do it. I moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Cole? Your first assignment is to personally apologize to every employee over 40 in your department. Not a group email, not a company-wide memo. Individual, face-to-face conversations where you acknowledge your past behavior and commit to doing better. Emily, that's accountability. Something you've managed to avoid until now. I met his eyes one final time. You have a choice, Cole. You can fight this process and prove that people like you can't change, or you can embrace it and become the kind of leader this company actually needs. What kind of leader is that? The kind who sees potential in everyone, regardless of their age. The kind who understands that innovation comes from combining different perspectives, not from discarding older ones. The kind who values results over youth, wisdom over enthusiasm. I left him sitting there with his new reality spread across his desk in carefully documented detail. As I walked back to my office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of taking action rather than simply enduring. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity as Cole began the difficult work of transforming himself and his department. True to his word, he scheduled individual meetings with every employee over 40, starting with Tom from IT and Janet from marketing. I didn't sit in on these conversations, but I heard about them through the office grapevine. Awkward at first, then gradually more genuine as Cole struggled to articulate his changing perspectives. I established my own routine of checking in with affected employees, not to monitor Cole's progress, but to understand how the changes were being received. The conversations were revealing. He seemed really uncomfortable at first, Tom told me during one of our coffee conversations. Like he was reading from a script, but then he started asking questions about my experience, about what I'd learned over the years. Real questions, not just polite ones. Janet had a similar story. He admitted that he'd never really thought about age bias before. Said he'd always assumed that younger meant more innovative, more adaptable. He seemed genuinely surprised when I told him about some of the process improvements I'd suggested that got ignored. But the real test came 3 weeks into the initiative, when Cole was assigned his first cross-generational project team. The task was to develop a new client onboarding system that could streamline our sign-up process while maintaining the personal touch that distinguished Veritech from our competitors. His team included Sarah Brennan, a 28-year-old UI designer fresh from art school, Marcus Thompson, a 52-year-old systems architect who'd been with the company for 15 years, and Patricia Gonzalez, a 61-year-old client relations specialist who knew more about customer needs than anyone else in the building. I watched from a distance as Cole navigated the challenge of leading a team where his usual tactics wouldn't work. He couldn't dismiss Marcus's concerns about system integration as legacy thinking, when Marcus was the one who'd built most of the systems. He couldn't ignore Patricia's warnings about client expectations when she'd managed relationships with our biggest accounts for over a decade. Instead, he had to learn to listen, to ask questions, to synthesize different perspectives into solutions that none of them could have developed alone. The breakthrough came during their 4th week of collaboration. I was passing the conference room where they were working when I heard Cole's voice, animated and excited. "Wait, Patricia, say that again about the client consultation phase. Marcus, what if we could automate the technical setup while preserving the personal consultation element that Patricia's talking about?" I paused by the window, watching as the 3 team members leaned over their shared workspace, building on each other's ideas with the kind of energy that comes from genuine collaboration. Sarah was sketching interface designs that incorporated Marcus's technical requirements and Patricia's user experience insights. Marcus was explaining system capabilities in terms that addressed both Sarah's creative vision and Patricia's practical concerns. And Patricia was translating client needs into technical specifications that both her teammates could understand and implement. For the first time since he'd joined Veritech, Cole was learning rather than lecturing. 2 days later, he knocked on my office door with an expression I'd never seen before, uncertain but hopeful, like a student who thinks he might have found the right answer but isn't quite sure. "Emily, do you have a few minutes? I'd like to show you something." I followed him to the conference room where his team had been working. The walls were covered with flowcharts, wireframes, and technical diagrams that represented weeks of intensive collaboration. "We've developed something," Cole said, his voice carrying a note of excitement I'd never heard before. "A client onboarding system that's completely automated on the back end, but feels entirely personal on the front end." He walked me through the design, explaining how Sarah's interface work created an intuitive user experience, how Marcus's systems architecture enabled seamless integration with existing platforms, and how Patricia's client relations expertise had informed every decision about user flow and communication touchpoints. "The really innovative part," Cole continued, "is how we've embedded institutional knowledge into the system itself. Patricia documented decades of client interaction patterns, and Marcus figured out how to translate that into algorithmic responses that feel human. I studied the diagrams, impressed despite myself. This is sophisticated work. It's also something none of us could have done alone," Cole said quietly. "Sarah has the creative vision, but she's never dealt with enterprise-level client needs. Marcus understands the technical requirements, But he's not a designer. Patricia knows exactly what clients want, but she's not a coder. And you? I learned to ask the right questions and get out of the way. He paused, looking around the room at the evidence of their collaboration. Emily, I think I understand now what you meant about innovation coming from experience. What do you mean? I mean that Sarah's designs are brilliant because they're informed by Patricia's understanding of client psychology. Marcus's architecture is elegant because it addresses real-world problems that only come from years of implementation experience. The innovation isn't in discarding what came before, it's in building on it. For the first time since this whole process began, I felt genuinely hopeful about Cole's transformation. There's something else, he said, his voice becoming more serious. I owe you an apology. Not just for what I said in that meeting, but for the assumptions I brought to this job, for the people I dismissed, the opportunities I wasted, the culture I was helping to create. Cole, let me finish. Please. He looked directly at me, his usual corporate confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. I spent 6 months trying to prove that youth and ambition were all this company needed. What I actually proved was that arrogance and ignorance are a dangerous combination. And now? Now I want to prove that someone like me can learn to be someone better, that the Cultural Sustainability Initiative isn't just good policy, it's good business. I nodded, recognizing the sincerity in his voice. So, what's your next step? I want to present our onboarding system to the board, not as my project, but as proof of what cross-generational collaboration can accomplish. He gestured to the walls covered with their team's work. And I want to use it as a case study for rolling out the initiative company-wide. That's ambitious. That's necessary. Emily, if we can show concrete results, measurable improvements in both innovation and employee satisfaction, then other companies will have to pay attention. We could change how the entire industry thinks about age and experience. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the evidence of transformation that covered every surface. Charts and graphs that showed how different perspectives had combined to create something genuinely innovative. Sketches and diagrams that proved wisdom and enthusiasm could work together rather than in opposition. Set up the board presentation for next week, I said finally. And Cole, make sure Sarah, Marcus, and Patricia are there to present alongside you. This was their success as much as yours. The board presentation took place on a Thursday afternoon that felt charged with possibility. Cole had prepared meticulously, but more importantly, he'd prepared his team. Sarah had crafted a visual presentation that made the technical complexity accessible to non-engineers. Marcus had developed performance metrics that demonstrated the system's efficiency gains. Patricia had compiled client feedback that showed how the new approach addressed long-standing concerns about impersonal automation. And Cole had learned to be a facilitator rather than the star of the show. 6 weeks ago, he began, addressing the 5 board members. Emily challenged me to prove that cross-generational collaboration could drive innovation rather than hinder it. What you're about to see is the result of that challenge. He stepped aside, giving his team members the floor to present their work. I watched from the back of the room as Sarah explained the user experience design philosophy. Marcus detailed the technical architecture, and Patricia walked through the client engagement strategy. Each presentation built on the others, creating a comprehensive picture of how different types of expertise had combined to solve a complex business problem. When they finished, the room was quiet for a moment as the board members absorbed what they'd seen. Margaret Santos spoke first. This is impressive work, but I have to ask, how do we know this approach is scalable? This was one project with hand-picked team members. Cole stepped forward. That's exactly what we plan to find out. We want to roll out the Cultural Sustainability Initiative across all departments, using this project as a model for how cross-generational teams can function. Patricia Williams raised her hand. What kind of timeline are we talking about? 60 days for initial implementation across all project teams, 6 months for full cultural integration, including updated hiring practices, performance evaluation criteria, and management training. Robert Martinez looked skeptical. Cole, this represents a significant change in how we operate. What makes you confident it will work? Because it already is working, Cole replied, his voice steady with conviction. Our client onboarding system isn't just technically superior to what we had before. It's also more innovative, more user-friendly, and more aligned with our actual business needs. And it exists because we combined 61 years of client relations experience with 15 years of systems architecture knowledge and fresh design thinking. He clicked to his final slide, showing projected outcomes for company-wide implementation. But the real measure of success isn't going to be one project or one team. It's going to be whether we can create a culture where Sarah wants to stay and learn from Patricia, where Marcus feels valued for his experience rather than worried about his age, and where the next Cole Maddox who walks through our doors learns to lead through inclusion rather than exclusion. David Chen leaned forward. And you believe you can lead that kind of transformation? I believe I have to, Cole said simply, because the alternative is continuing to waste talent, driving away experience, and limiting our innovative capacity to whatever one generation can imagine. The board voted unanimously to approve the Cultural Sustainability Initiative's company-wide implementation. But more importantly, they voted to trust Cole with the responsibility of proving that people could change, that organizations could evolve, and that experience and enthusiasm could work together to drive innovation. 6 months later, I sat in the same conference room where Cole had once called me a fossil, but everything else had changed. The morning leadership meeting now included representatives from every department and every generation, from recent graduates to employees in their 60s. The agenda focused not just on quarterly numbers, but on cultural metrics, employee satisfaction across age groups, retention rates for experienced workers, innovation outputs from cross-generational teams. Cole had transformed from the man who dismissed older employees as outdated to someone who regularly sought out the most experienced voices in the room. His presentations now included data on mentorship program outcomes, successful intergenerational project completions, and industry recognition for Veritech's innovative approach to inclusive leadership. Our Q4 results show the Cultural Sustainability Initiative's impact across multiple metrics, he was saying, clicking through slides that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier. Employee satisfaction is up 18% overall, with the most significant gains among workers over 45. Our retention rate for experienced employees has improved by 32%. And our innovation output, measured by successful product launches and client adoption rates, has increased by 26%. Janet from marketing raised her hand. Cole, what do you attribute the innovation increase to? Cross-pollination of ideas and perspectives, he replied without hesitation. When you combine fresh thinking with institutional knowledge, when you pair technical expertise with user experience wisdom, you get solutions that neither group would develop independently. Tom from IT nodded. The mentorship program has been particularly effective. I've learned more about emerging technologies in the past 4 months than in the previous 2 years, and I've been able to share troubleshooting strategies that have saved our younger developers weeks of trial and error. Which brings me to our next initiative, Cole continued, his enthusiasm evident. We've been approached by 3 other technology companies who want to implement similar programs. I'd like to propose that we develop a consulting branch focused on helping other organizations create inclusive, innovative cultures. The suggestion sparked immediate interest around the table. Here was Cole, the man who'd once believed that innovation required discarding experience, proposing to export the value of intergenerational collaboration to the entire industry. After the meeting, I walked with Cole back to his office, the same space where we'd had our first confrontation, but now filled with awards for innovative management, testimonials from team members across age groups, and planning documents for initiatives that would never have occurred to his earlier self. Emily, he said as we reached his door, I wanted to thank you for something. What's that? For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. For believing that someone could change that fundamentally. Cole, the capacity for change was always there. You just needed the right motivation to access it. The right motivation and the right consequences, he corrected with a smile. You made it impossible for me to succeed without becoming a better person. And how do you feel about that now? Grateful, humbled, and honestly, a little embarrassed about who I was 6 months ago. He paused, looking around his office at the evidence of his transformation, but mostly determined to make sure that the changes stick, that they spread, and that no one else has to go through what you went through to make them happen. As I walked back to my own office, I thought about my father and the company he'd built on the belief that innovation comes from combining experience with imagination, wisdom with wonder. For 24 years, I'd watched that vision slowly erode as corporate culture shifted toward valuing youth over expertise, potential over proven ability. But now, as I looked around at the transformed environment Cole was helping to create, I could see my father's vision coming alive again, not as a relic of the past, but as a blueprint for the future, not as resistance to change, but as the foundation for sustainable innovation. The best revenge, I realized, hadn't been removal or punishment, it had been transformation, of Cole, of the company, and of the industry's understanding of what true innovation required. And sometimes, to change a system, you don't destroy it, you upgrade it.